which takes place in form of panel discussion. My name is Susan Kuivalainen, and I work with the Finnish Center for Pensions, and it's my great pleasure to be here and be able to host this panel discussion. The topic of the panel is the Nordic welfare state in changing Europe, divergences and similarities. We will discuss in line with the overall conference theme towards resilient Nordic welfare state, challenges, responses and consequences. We will talk about the key characteristics of the Nordic welfare state, challenges it is facing, as well as how well the countries have responded to these challenges, and furthermore, how the future looks like. This conference is also a kick-off for the Nordic Welfare Research Network, and thereby we will discuss the whereabouts of this collaboration. We have 4 panelists. Jon Kvist, a professor from Roskilde University, Denmark. Jon has over the years, over the decades, studied the Nordic welfare state and has edited a number of volumes on the Nordic welfare model, and was one of the establishing fathers of the European Social Policy Analysis Network. Nice to have you here, Jon. Next to Jon, we are delighted to have Gunni Björk Idal, professor from the University of Iceland. She is also an expert on the Nordic welfare state and has published widely on the Nordic family policies, and has written on the experiences of the Iceland before and after the harsh economic crisis. Next to Gunni, we have Rune Halvorsen, associate professor from Oslo Metropolitan University. Rune's main interests are European and comparative welfare policy, social citizenship, and citizenship movements. His recent research projects have focused on active citizenship, poverty, disability, and youth transitions, and he has led a number of cross-national projects funded by the Nordic Council. Delighted to have you here, Rune. And then Professor Kenneth Nelson from University of Stockholm, where he's currently head of the social policy unit at the Swedish Institute for Social Research, SOFI. Kenneth's research focuses on the causes and consequences of the welfare state and social policy, often in comparative perspective. He has worked as an independent expert for various national and international government agencies and organizations. We are happy to have you here, Kenneth. We have 4 distinguished scholars who have wide knowledge on the Nordic welfare state, and who have been also very actively involved in cross-national networks and cross-national research projects. I'm really looking forward to this panel discussion and our talk. For the audience, we have also the possibility to offer you to take actively part in our discussions. Those of you who have downloaded the conference app, you don't. Okay, I will take this way. Okay, those of you who have downloaded the conference app, you find there 2 new icons. One with the live Q&A, through which you can send questions or comments, and they will appear here. And somebody from the audience, most likely Paula, will point to me that, okay, there's the questions and comments we should look at. Then there's another icon called Live Poll app. And you should open your app and then open the Live Poll icon, which you see there, and follow the simple instructions. At some point, it is you should enter a PIN number there. Is it asking it? 4433. And you should have a green light indicating that everything is properly connected. So the PIN number or code is 4433. And we have prepared 3 questions for the audience, and hopefully the technique works. We are brave because this is the test version of the app, but thought that it will offer a wonderful opportunity for interactive discussion. Wonderful. And those of you who are active on Twitter, remember to use the hashtag Nordic Espanet when you are tweeting from the conference or from this panel session. Okay, let's start, dear colleagues. The Nordic welfare states continue to attract great interest all over the world, as we heard yesterday several times. But we know also that there is quite a lot of questioning whether there is an actual Nordic model. Are the Nordic welfare states somehow distinct from the other European countries or from the other affluent countries? So, what is your opinion? What would you say? Is there a Nordic model? And what are the characters that distinguish the Nordic countries from the other countries? And I'm so happy that Jon decided to sit here in the first seat, because I heard last week Jon giving a lecture in Copenhagen where he was talking about the Nordic model.
Okay. I don't think it's the place to start lecturing anybody about the Nordic model in this audience. So perhaps just to recap, if we compare ourselves to how the situation looks like in other countries, I think one of the distinct traits is the emphasis we put on securing that everybody has autonomy, that they are able to realize their lives with regard to forming families, getting education, and getting work and being in good health. So in these different domains of life, I think that our welfare states have a bigger role compared to that in other countries. So it is the legitimacy of the state in intervening in people's life conditions in order to maximize the realization of their human potential. I think that is the key part of the Nordic welfare model. It's a key part of the Nordic welfare model that we maybe forget in our day-to-day discussions about welfare reforms and what have you, where this may not be the center stage of the discussions, but we can come back to the politics of welfare reform later on. But I think securing human potential and securing the autonomy of people is like the main trait of the Nordic welfare model, if you're going to put it down to one feature, which is not fair. And if you look at how we do it, it's mainly through services. So I know that we are a lot of people here who are studying social security and minimum income schemes, and that's very good, but other countries have invented these schemes too. Where we stand apart is very much on the emphasis we have on social services, family policies, labor market policies, health and education programs. that's where we have built up a big sector that is not parallel to the same extent in other countries.
Thank you. And you, Gunning? Yeah.
Maybe to add up on that, I think we might want to remember the gender perspective, because we've been in 3 sessions talking about the paid parental leave, and that's surely something that distinguishes us from the rest of the European countries. And the further we go away from our region, the more clear our model becomes. And I think also we should keep in mind the children, because our child policies, Norway being the forerunner and the other countries leading in child protection, in children's rights and services for children. So we are maybe more special than we kind of tend to remember when we are discussing the differences between our 5 countries in our sessions. So I think we should keep these 2 issues also in mind. And now I'm looking at one of the few housing scholars in the room. Maybe we need to keep that also in mind, that our housing systems are a little bit special, and we don't discuss that often enough.
Thank you. Very, very good points. And Rune, what are your thoughts?
So I think one dimension that has been often missing in the discussions about the Nordic model is the differences in what we sometimes refer to as social regulation policies, the employment protection, the non-discrimination regulations, the policies that are aiming to address employers and also the providers of the behavior of providers of goods and services. So I think that's a dimension that sometimes complicates and makes the questions a bit and makes the picture more mixed than is sometimes reflected in discussion about whether does exist a Nordic model. And you find that partly in the discussion about flexicurity and how Denmark, perhaps in particular, distinguishes itself from perhaps especially the other Scandinavian, but also the other Nordic countries more generally. So I think that's something that could have been and needs more attention. And then a second dimensional factor is that is frequently claimed that universalism is a key characteristic of the Nordic model, but that seems to be at least a feature that is challenged by and under pressure in several of the Nordic countries. Thank you.
Thank you. Kenneth, I know you have been traveling around the world and telling about the Nordic model. What do you tell your audience in Brazil, for example?
Yeah, I tend to develop a more and more pessimistic approach for every year.
That happens when you get older?
Yeah. But I'm also sort of a little bit puzzled, because every time when you look at those EU rankings, when we look at outcomes in terms of labor force participation, poverty, inequality, and stuff like that, the Nordic countries always perform good, and we're top on the league. But on the other hand, at least when I look at the social policies as such, I see quite clear tendencies that the Nordic countries are moving apart. Sweden is going further and further down to the bottom. We have one of the worst old age pension systems in the rich countries, among the rich countries. Social assistance is becoming less generous. Unemployment insurance, I think last estimate was that among the unemployed in Sweden, only about 40% qualify for an earnings-related benefit. And we see this sort of a little bit of dismounting of the welfare state. I think we can see in Finland as well, clear tendencies. We don't see it in Norway, or at least I don't see it in Norway when I look at the data that I have. And Denmark, I'm a little bit uncertain about, basically because you always have been a little bit of an outlier in the Nordic context. And then we have the service sector, where at least Sweden we have a lot of privatization or semi-privatization going on and stuff like that. So I to some extent agree with Rune that there are clear tendencies that at least some of the Nordic countries are moving away from this traditional social democratic universal welfare state. But on the other hand, when we look at the outcomes, we are still performing good. And I sometimes wonder why we perform so good when the policies are getting worse. Yeah, so I'm a bit skeptical whether we can talk about the Nordic model or not. Maybe we can talk about the Nordic model in terms of outcomes. I'm more skeptical talking about it in terms of the social policies as such.
Thank you. Would some of you like to reflect?
Maybe just to mention, we already see some changes in the outcomes, for example, in child poverty in Sweden, so something is happening.
Yeah. We see it also among the elderly. We did a report for the World Bank recently, and we see that relative poverty is increasing among the elderly, and elderly incomes among the elderly are now more unequal than incomes in the working age population. So inequalities are reinforced in old age. So a lot of things happen. But on the other hand, when we look at child poverty, when we look at the absolute levels and compare the Nordic countries to the rest of Europe, we still perform good, although we're not as good as we used to be.
Yeah, I found this really interesting that when you're looking at sort of the wider outcomes, not only child poverty, but more widely child well-being, the results are such what you said, Kenneth, that Finland, of course, always stands out that all the Nordic countries are among the best countries in the world in these well-being aspects. Okay, let's be brave and ask from the audience. We start our first poll. Can I put it on now, Paula?
Which is the best Nordic country? I think there's only one box for Sweden, I think, in the app.
It's not working yet. Okay, but the question is, you can see it in your app when you go there, the live poll. Is the Nordic welfare model still a supermodel? Supermodel. That's how it was called 2 years ago in some, it was a newspaper called The Economist, not The Newsweek. That's how the title went. Seconds left. Okay. 10 seconds. And you can, of course, think about the answer to this question: is the Nordic welfare model still a supermodel? Based on the answers we get from the audience. And Paula will be our results secretary. No, that is so old-fashioned. Okay, six. So could we sort of conclude that the majority of those who responded and used the modern app still think that the Nordic welfare model is a supermodel? Were you surprised by the results?
In a way,
No, don't take into account the response rate.
in a way I was, because one thing is, if you look at the outcomes, you could perhaps argue along those lines, but I'm not so convinced that people in non-Nordic countries would say that this model is applicable or possible to adopt elsewhere with different institutional configurations. So, so it's, in that way, I think it's perhaps overstated to claim it to be a supermodel, because we have to take into account that the welfare mix is very different, and the path dependencies and institutional settings are quite different elsewhere in Europe and the rest of the world, of course.
Yeah, you mentioned here it was John or Kenneth that the outcomes are good, but the policies are not doing so well. The measures that are used or are reformed in Nordic countries. So if you think about the sort of the recent development and the ongoing discussions and policy reforms in your country, could you share your sort of quick analysis of the current state, and do you see the core values of the Nordic welfare model sort of in contradiction, at risk somehow? Should we now start with Kenneth?
Okay, yeah. At the moment in Sweden, or at least the way I read the newspapers, is that there is no major discussion about welfare or social security, I think, at the moment in Sweden. But there are some underlying issues which probably will be brought on the table, and obviously one such issue is privatization, of course, in schools and in healthcare. Another issue is, of course, old age pensions, which I think should be. There have been some investigations on it, but I think that what we really need to discuss much more is the occupational pillar in the pension system, and what we should do with those 10% that are not in collective agreements, because those are the ones who will fall in poverty in old age. But there is also a problem in Sweden, as you probably know, all of you, is that the government is quite weak. The previous government was very weak. This government is even weaker. So I don't think that we can expect any major changes, because it's almost impossible to take any major changes in terms of welfare through the parliament at the moment.
Okay, thanks. Rune?
So I think one aspect that perhaps that concerns me is that traditionally the Nordic welfare model has been based on rather collaborative and industrial relations with agreements between the social partners and the government, and also with a tradition for strong involvement of civil society organizations to reach consensus, and with declining trade union density, and in some countries you also see declining financial support to civil society organizations, or even involvement of them in the deliberation of social policies. I think there's a risk that the trust in the government and the overall glue in the system might be sort of under pressure here. So that might cause larger conflicts around social policy issues than we have been used to in the Nordic countries.
Thank you.
Yeah. I could also then add that we lost trust in politics and parliament during the crisis. And it's about 12% the trust to parliament right now. So it hasn't been restored. So you could say that even though we have recovered from the crisis economically, the trust crisis is still ongoing. And this is, of course, very serious and unusual in the Nordic context. But otherwise, there's not much new from the welfare system. Nothing is happening, absolutely nothing. It's still standing. We still drive towards the Nordic model. And the only thing changes is actually a reinforcement of the Nordic model in terms of child policies. We have a strong social minister who has put children first, and he has even changed the name of the ministry to Ministry of Children and Social Affairs. So he just a few days ago declared that he wants to eliminate children's poverty. So we're on the move in that sense, but otherwise we're mainly restoring what we had to cut during the crisis years. So that's the situation there.
Thank you. So we are sharing the troubles we have nationally. So in Denmark, as you may know, we have a coalition government led by a liberal conservative type of party. And they have reduced benefits that goes to child families, especially if these child families have been living abroad for a number of years. So at the moment we are having a social safety net that is like this. And then if you have been living abroad for a number of years, it will be a lower safety net. So we are operating with a two-track system or safety nets at different levels depending on who you are. So that is definitely a path departure, I would say, from the Nordic model. However, if we have a change of government, there's an election coming up the 17th of June at the latest, then these policy measures will be abolished by the incoming Social Democratic-led coalition government. So what we are seeing is a battle forth and back on these benefits, minimum income benefits that are going to child families, mostly from an ethnic minority background. So the Social Democrats and other parties on the left wing, they call them poverty benefits, not meaning that they help you out of poverty, but giving you poverty instead. So that's a very direct battle between left and right. Then I think on a even, I don't know if it's more pessimistic, but another pessimistic note is that we are, of course, having an aging population, which means a lot of the professionals in the welfare sector are now retiring at the same time as we are seeing the need for care increasing, not just healthcare and long-term care, but also in psychiatry and in a lot of other institutions. So we have fewer heads and hands to take care of bigger needs. That is a problem that I think is really troublesome. The good thing, if there is a good thing, then I think it is that things are going really bad also outside of Scandinavia. So I think it helps people mobilize, and we're seeing that there are parties on probably on the left, the trade unions, for example, that are calling for a fight against inequality. So suddenly inequality is appearing on the political agenda much more than previously. And here, of course, we have a special justification in the Nordic countries to come in and say, how can we actually fight inequality and then be more conscious about that? So it's dark tunnel, but I see some lights here and there.
Good. Thank you. So there's a sort of a bit different trends going on in your country. There's some good, positive development, what you see, but perhaps more of sort of worrying development. We have one question from the audience, which I will now read to you, since some of you cannot see it. If the Nordic welfare states are now going downhill, when was the peak time for each of them, and what caused the slide towards the bottom?
Is it a book project? It's like, it's
It's the book project.
Yeah, okay, I can start. Or should we, or was it to the audience? Or to
That's the question from the audience,
question
wasn't it?
from the audience. Ah, well, yeah, it's a book project, but very short. For the Swedish case, I would say the peak was early 1990, and then from 1991 and onwards, it's just downhill. Now, we had obviously we had the crisis in the early 1990s, where a few things were changed in social policy, but then we sort of took back those changes and improved policies again. But then we also had 8 years of probably the most neoliberal government in Europe at the time, which were also very, very clever government, and they did some changes, privatized the service sector, they made it more difficult for people to get access to unemployment benefits and so forth. And then we had the big pension reform, and so I would say that there are sort of two downward trends, the one in the early 1990s and then during the 8 years of neoliberal politics. But 1990 was a good year.
Okay. In the other Nordic countries, do you find sort of a similar time curve?
No, I would say that Iceland peaked in 1946, because then we made the best social security legislation in the world. But since then, we have been struggling with reaching the other countries. So, yeah, we're still peaking, maybe.
Well, yeah, I think it's probably more or less the same for Norway as for Sweden, that the late 1980s, early 1990s were perhaps better or state of affairs for the Nordic welfare model, and then it has been under pressure for several reasons. One, obviously, the business cycle with and the Nordic countries have been differently exposed to the financial crisis and the recession in aftermath of the crisis, but also earlier we know that the Nordic countries have had quite different levels of unemployment, with high unemployment rates in Denmark and Finland than in Norway during some time spells. So that has probably also contributed to slightly different trajectories in the Nordic countries. But then, of course, you have had the experience of increasing global interdependencies and the way perceived need to reform the systems to make the systems more sustainable. With demographic aging, as Jon mentioned earlier, also as an other dimension that's significantly contributing to as a driving force behind the reforms. Yes.
Great.
I'm not going to say that the situation 30 years ago was better than it is today.
Great.
I think that's not the case for very many groups in society. I think that for a lot of groups, they're much better off today than they were 30 years ago. This goes for mentally ill, this goes for elderly, it goes for a lot of groups, and homeless, and for a lot of groups. It's not to say that we're living in a rosy world now. I think that we still have problems. I still think that people with mental illness, for example, are not seen to the same extent as people with physical incapacities. So I think that we still have a long way to go, and I think that perhaps we should not look to other countries only for seeing if they have an alternative that we would like. I don't think that's the case, actually, and I think that's one of the rationales for having conferences like this, is that we learn more from one another about what has been going on that is working well. So yes, the world is not going too well in the Nordic countries in some areas, but I think we know where these areas are, and I think we also know how to fix those problems. So I think that's what we should do.
Can I just
Yes.
add to
Go ahead.
John's comment that, yes, I agree that we need perhaps a more differentiated picture here. Social inequalities, we know at least in Norway, are higher today than they used to be in the 1980s, 1990s. But for certain population groups or citizens groups, I agree that the situation has become better. That I think it's fair to say, for instance, for women's position in the labour market, for women's independence, financial independence, for instance, has become improved. And also the social movements on ethnicity, on LGBT issues, on the disability movement and so on have contributed to improve the living conditions and the well-being for those groups. To answer properly this big question, I think we, in addition to a focus on class, we also need a gender perspective, but also focus more generally also on intersectionality.
Yeah, well, to some extent I agree with Jon. So the poor people are getting richer, that's for sure, in Nordic countries. The problem is that the rest of the society is getting even richer, more richer. So the inequalities are increasing, like Rune said. And obviously from a sociological perspective, that's very problematic. And it has consequences in terms of trust, in terms of conflicts, in terms of the possibility to mobilize across, interest groups and stuff like that. So I think that's quite worrying, and we can also see it in health, for example, when we look at absolute health in terms of looking at how healthy the Swedish and the Norwegian population is. We are among the most healthiest in the world. The strange thing is that when we look at inequalities in health, we perform exactly as other countries. So from that perspective, one could say that well, it's good that the poor are getting richer, it's good that we are a healthy population, but there's some fundamentally wrong when inequalities are increasing. And I think that the consequences of increased inequality can be quite severe in the future, because the consequences are probably long-term.
Go ahead. Shortly, we have several questions.
Okay,
here.
sorry.
Hopefully they are questions and not
Yes,
titles of the book.
Yeah, so I agree with Kenneth that the poorer has become richer, but they're still relatively poor. That's true, but I think it does matter for your health, for example, whether you are relatively healthier than you were previously, even though that you are still suffering from inequalities in health. Another thing is that I think what we should remember is what we have learned, I think, for many years, is that it's not only static pictures we should look at how well-being is, it's more dynamic pictures. It is whether people are caught in adverse situations with regard to their health or their economic situation or what have you, or whether they are in a position where they're moving from one stage to another stage, to a better health or to a more stable position in the labor market. So having these more dynamic understandings about how the labor market and families and what have you works, I think, is one of the contributions we should make as social researchers to the knowledge pool out there.
What do the others think about of this Jon's suggestion that we should have more as a dynamic approach? Kenneth, Rune?
Well, no, I totally agree. Of course, it may not be so problematic if you end up in poverty or something like that during a short phase of your life course, compared to a situation when you are poor in each of those phases. So obviously to look at poverty and inequalities and well-being, like from a more dynamic life course perspective, is of course important.
Just adding to the picture, I mean, if we think in historical terms, we also have the new challenges due to disasters that we were discussing in a workshop earlier. We have the ecological challenges, and I mean, this will create huge tasks for the welfare state, and we are not really maybe addressing it enough. So I think in 1990s or 46 might have been easier than today, if we think in dynamic terms.
That's a good point. We are living in a more complex society and world where the issues are more global. We have two questions from the audience. We take them now. If individual autonomy via the state is defining the Nordic trait, then jump somewhere. Then what policies should be pursued or strengthened in the future? So sort of the future-orientated questions.
Investments in human capital, I would say. In the end, social protection is only, you know, it's like you take a pill for a disease. You know, I think that the only way forward actually is by investing in people, investing in human capital, so they do not need to rely on welfare and social protection.
But I suppose the ultimate test is to what extent people have actually the resources, but also the freedom to live the life they want and have reasons to want for themselves, in line with, at least if we follow the reasoning behind a capability approach to social policy, for instance. The idea in the capability approach is not only to what extent people have access to the same types of resources, but whether people actually, given their particular situation and needs, are able to make use of those resources to pursue their life goals, and whether they also are involved in making the final decisions about what kind of services they need, and if they are consulted and their opinions are given importance or weight in the implementation of the investments in human capital, as you mentioned.
Social investment, your answer as well?
Well, I've never really liked that concept, social investment, even though I like what it brings about. I think our concept in the title of this conference, resilience, is so much better. And talk about empowerment, user involvement, and resilience. How we increase resilience and decrease vulnerability is much more respectful approach towards the individual. And I think we might want to add the children here, because we would like to see, I think Norway has done such a good job in promoting the Children's Rights Convention in regards to children's opinions. And I think we have a lot to learn from them and those who have taken that seriously. And now we see that, what's her name? Greta from Sweden is leading a social movement on her own. And I think we should listen to these children more than we do today.
That's a good point today.
Yeah, so I agree with the former speakers, so I'm not going to repeat what they said. But just to say that there are certain groups in the Nordic countries that do not have autonomy. We invest in a lot of people and try to secure them autonomy, but sometimes we forget the relatives of people. So forgetting the relatives of people with handicap, people with diseases. So we are offering people carer leaves. So you are getting time off work to take care of your relative who are ill or who is a child or who may be in care of need for other reasons. But the carer, him or herself, do not get time off to restitute themselves. So repeat offers is something that we are not very good at in the Nordic countries. We expect an increasing amount of impact from our civil society, but we are not paralleling it with rights to these people who are actually carrying out the caring. So I think that is a blind spot of the Nordic welfare model with regard to autonomy, and which does not fit a modern world where we're talking about dual earner couples and all these sort of things.
Good point.
Good point indeed.
Yeah, may I just clarify possible misunderstanding between Gunni and myself around the concept of social investment. I don't only refer to that concept because that's something that's typically occur in the literature, but I think what we're talking about here is recognition of the diversity in needs, but also the need to ensure the representation of marginalized and socially excluded population groups in the not only the deliberation of the policies, but also in its implementation in the local social services.
Total agreement.
Yeah. Good. We have one more question here from the audience, a bit into a different direction. What should be the role of the Nordic countries in developing EU's social dimension? So far, the Nordics have been against the EU social policy developments. Would you, Jon, like to start? Do you agree with the questions?
Yeah, I think it's very funny. We have this ambiguity that when we face the EU, we are proud of our model, and then we are afraid that if we start dealing with social policy in the EU, then our model will crumble, that we will sort of meet each other on a lower denominator. So far, nothing bad has happened. So Denmark has been part of the EU since 1973, and I still think that we are part of the Nordic welfare club, even though we may be an outlier. So I think that, yes, we should actually be perhaps more active in promoting the Nordic welfare model and say what is working and what is not working in the model more openly to the EU. And there seems to be a big interest in it, even though that, of course, they don't call it a Nordic model because you cannot sell a Nordic model to Greece or Italy or something like that. You know, then you use the words of social investments because that's what we are doing, and that's more acceptable in this context. So yes, I think we should talk more about what we are doing and not call it Nordic, but
call it something else.
Call it what
but
it is.
You are in favor of more active role of the Nordic countries when it comes to the EU social dimension.
I think there are two ways to influence policy making in the EU. One way is, of course, that we are more active, as Jon Christ said, but another way which we constantly influence EU decision making is when we produce all these reports on outcomes and policy. And we do this for Sweden, we do it for Denmark, we do it for all the European countries. And of course, those reports do not go unnoticed. So obviously policymakers see that, well, the Nordic countries are always best in the class. So that is also one way to influence decision making, although it may not be as visible as having a politician talking loud to the parliament.
Yeah, but go ahead.
So I've two examples where the Nordic countries have figured as examples to follow by other EU members. First, the youth guarantee has been modeled from Sweden, I think from Denmark, that has been now adopted into the European, official European level policies. And also, for instance, the recommendation on active inclusion from 2008 also referred to Sweden as an example of a more active labour market policy. So you see from time to time how also the Commission is referring to various Nordic countries. As for Norway, Norway is obviously not sitting around the table together with the EU 28 member states. Nevertheless, and we are not a member or taking part in the European semester cycle. But nevertheless, there are also some opportunities for Norwegian stakeholders to be involved, partly through European level umbrella organizations that have various forms, various meetings points and platforms for policy learning and policy exchange. And we also have, on the academic side, networks such as the Social Policy Expert Group and similar organizations or mechanisms in place that provides opportunities to influence also on the social policies of the EU.
Would you like to add something to that?
Not much to add, just I think we should use every opportunity. It's as simple as that.
So you are all in favor of more active role of the Nordic countries, especially sort of promoting the Nordic model, which you will not call as a Nordic model among the EU people, but as a social investment. But do you think, would there be something to learn from the other European countries? Although Jon previously said that this is not like learning from the other countries, that the sort of the Nordic countries are good references and good places to learn from each other. But must ask that question, since you all spoke in that way when you talk about the EU policy.
I can start. I think Jon was pointing out this with family carers. I mean, we have a lot to learn from other countries in that respect. And not only European countries, but also America. They have much better schemes and supports than we have. And in so many aspects, we could learn from others. So we should be humble at the same time.
Good. Then I will ask you a simple question. What would you import from some other country? Start with the Kenneth there. Short.
Something blue and yellow.
Yeah, import. Yeah, I don't know. Dutch licorice, maybe?
Yeah.
No, yeah, well, I think I would import, it's a tricky question, but I think that I would import better protection for unemployed workers.
Better protection for unemployed workers.
Where Sweden nowadays definitely is not among the best in the class.
Are you talking about the financial support or are you talking about the services?
I'm talking about the financial support, to some extent also services, because we still spend a lot of money on active labor market policy in Sweden, but that money has shifted into cheaper programs that basically doesn't lead to employment, whereas those programs that actually may lead to employment are also more costly, and they're also basically abolished.
Great. Rune.
So I think one area where the Nordic countries have perhaps not been on the lead, but where in fact the European Commission and the UK have been more the front runners, has been in the adoption of non-discrimination regulations or non-discrimination legislation. So back with the adoption of the Maastricht Treaty, the treaty provided the grounds for the European Union to have more power or legal competence in non-discrimination law, and it has taken some time for several of the Nordic countries to adopt similar non-discrimination legislation, both for women and for minorities and so on. Sweden was quite early, or the first among the Nordic countries. Norway and Denmark and Iceland have responded later, and partly has been more reluctant, I think, than Sweden was initially. So this is an area I think we actually have something to learn from what's also going on elsewhere in Europe.
Okay, great. And how about you, Gudni? From the Icelandic perspective?
Oh, it's really hard to choose. Only one?
Only one.
Okay.
To keep it short.
Okay, to keep it short, I think I'm going to vote for the Spanish paid parental leave if they get through the 50-50 division between mothers and fathers.
Good.
So they're taking the lead.
Can I vote for the same? No, so the EU has indeed been an icebreaker, as Rune was saying, in discrimination issues, gender, and perhaps also increasingly in other areas where you can discriminate. So that is good, and I think that the new parental leave scheme that we have just had negotiated on the 29th of January, it was finished with the negotiations, is introducing 5 days for carers, so they can take days off for taking care of their children, their sick relatives, or their persons with handicap, or other relatives. I think that's a novelty in an EU social policy context that is bringing new life also into the Nordic countries. So that was interesting. More general policies, I would probably look for policies in the other Nordic countries, I must say.
Great, thank you. So I must ask this question. Now we have talked about the key characteristics of the Nordic model. What do you think are sort of the core values, and do you actually think that we have a Nordic model? And you were all agreeing that yes, we have a Nordic model, and we can still distinguish several characteristics. You saw some positive development and some negative development. We have shortly touched upon the challenges. I picked up that both Jon and Kenneth mentioned aging population, whereas Gudni took up the climate, environment aspect, and Rune took up sort of the loss in trust and decline in trade union memberships. Would you like to add something to the list of challenges that the Nordic welfare states are facing in near 10 years?
Well, we need to be better integrating migrants into society. At least Sweden needs to perform much better there. We also need to develop ways to cope with populism in policy making, which very much is related to social policy. So those are major issues that we haven't talked about.
So another factor that also, I think is representing potentially a risk for the Nordic countries is the alleged digitization of working life and digitalization of social services, and also the emerging so-called gig economy, with more persons employed in zero-hour contracts, or as self-employed, or as freelance consultants. I think it's still up the pipeline to what extent that actually is. We have statistics that support or to evaluate how strong that tendency or development trend is, but it's I think something that needs more attention in the future.
I would like to stress my point about the climate, because that will unfold so many challenges. And for example, we all have experienced the extreme weathers that have been hitting Nordic countries to a certain extent. and this mass migration that will follow the changes in weather and climate, and all kinds of social disasters are at least mapped when we look at the risk predictions. So we believe that, and when I say we are a small group of scholars who have been discussing disasters and welfare states. We believe that we have so much to prepare for that we haven't really addressed, because we are kind of in our boxes talking about the policies and what we usually do. We do not discuss this intersectionally, and we do not discuss what we are doing with, for example, emergency management. So we need to bring the dialogue further, and we have to start to prepare for quite different times than we are living right now. So I think we have a lot to do.
Would that be an excellent theme for some coming conferences, maybe? How well the Nordic countries are responding these questions. Jan, would you like to add something for the list of the challenges?
I think they are all very well placed, these challenges, so I think they are the major ones. And of course, we also have globalization as increasing competitiveness for more groups in society is one of them. I think that there are also promises, that technology is changing the labor market and the way that it works, but it may also give us new tools to improve the services we deliver and the way we deliver them. So I think that's also an important research field that is opening up for us. How can we use technology? How can we use behavioral insights from other fields than economics to help us inform policy making? I think that there are some nice possibilities for social researchers and social policy to go into.
Rune has written with his colleagues that bumblebee still flies. Haven't you?
We have, yes.
What do you think? And this is a question for the audience as well. You can take the poll. What do you think? Will the will the bumblebee fly in the 2030s?
Can I answer that?
You can answer that.
Yes.
Yes.
So 30 years ago, we were discussing whether it was the end of the Nordic welfare model. I think some of us talked about the title by Stefan Marklund, Paradise Lost, that in '89, you were seeing that we could no longer continue as we have. We are here today still talking about the Nordic welfare model, and I hope that we will also be here in some years ago. Olli Kankas once said it about the Swedish model, that no matter what happens to the Swedish model, no matter how many cuts you make, it will still remain Swedish. So of course we will have a Nordic model, but I hope it will also be one that we can praise for some good social outcomes.
Okay.
I can take the environmental issue again, because as we know, we are seeing fewer and fewer bees in general. So I would like to answer, it depends on how we behave if we have still a bumblebee in 2030.
Just to add to this, in Norway, obviously the dependency on incomes from oil will eventually decline, or at least there's an awareness that Norway needs to prepare for a different economy that is less oil dependent. So I think, in line with what Good News suggests, it depends on how well the government and other stakeholders respond to the new challenges and are forward-leading in finding proper balance between different types of social policy measures, combining both redistributive measures with more demand-side social regulation of access to the labour market and so on, and also involve citizens and citizens groups in those decision-making processes to make sure that there is to foster as much trust and then in the system, and also solidarity between population groups as possible.
Great. So we have one yes, perhaps, Kenneth. Will the bumble
Should I say no then? Well, it's a tricky question, because as Ole said, and as Jon said, that Ole said, of course, you know, it will be there in one form or the other. The thing is that the welfare states we have in the Nordic countries today are very different from the welfare states we had in the 1980s. And there is no way we're going to go back to the 1980s and how it looked like then, because the world is different today. And the labor market is different, the aging population and all that. So certainly the welfare state we will have in 2 decades ahead will be different from the one we have today. And I have strong worries for the Swedish welfare state in terms of poverty and inequality and stuff like that. I think we haven't seen the end of changing the Swedish welfare state in ways that definitely will increase poverty and inequality. I think we're gonna move closer to poverty rates and inequality rates that are prevalent on the continent in Europe. That's my pessimistic guess. Yeah.
Great.
Okay, not too many votes. 18 says yes, the bumblebee is still flying, and 4 votes for no.
Well, I guess that this audience is quite positive. They think that the Nordic model is a super model and it will fly, meaning that it's really successful. It's securing or maximizing the human capacity, as Jon was saying earlier, and still be economically efficient. Okay, one of the purposes of this conference is that it serves as a kick-off for the Nordic Welfare Research Network. The Nordic welfare states have been studied for many decades by the Nordic as well as the non-Nordic scholars. And occasionally there have been networks that allows collaboration between the researchers. After the end of the Nordic Centers for Excellence, the Nordvel and Reassess, there has not been a platform that would regularly bring together those scholars interested in the Nordic welfare state. And we have now discussed with this group and with some other group of people that we should establish a Nordic ESPANET network. What do you see? What are the benefits of this kind of network? What do we aim with the network? Kenneth, go ahead, you are already.
I think it's, you know, the overall objective, I think, is quite simple, to make Nordic research on social policy even better. That's why we engage, that's why we collaborate, that's why we share experiences and show our results, and we want feedback on what we're doing. So that would be my sort of first answer. And I also think that objective is very important, because for every year, social policy as an academic subject is just growing bigger and bigger and bigger. And we see that, for example, during the ESPANET conferences, which are also growing bigger and bigger for every year, even though 50% of all the papers submitted to the conference are rejected. So it's not only the economy that is being globalized and increased competitiveness, but also academia and research. And I think that in the Nordic countries we have had a very strong foothold in social policy research. And I think that if we want to be best in the league also in terms of doing social policy research, we need to collaborate.
Yeah. Good.
So I think for this kind of network, it's as important that we collaborate as critical friends who can help to improve each other's work, but also to stimulate perhaps more cross-country comparisons than is often the case, and move from single-country case studies to 2 or 3 or 4 country comparisons. And the Nordic countries provide opportunities to compare cases that are fairly similar, and it makes sense still to compare the Nordic countries, despite our questions about whether they are drifting apart. And I think also in the EU system, we see that it's often not possible to include all the Nordic countries within this same grant agreement, or when we're applying for money from the Horizon 2020, for instance, it's not possible to include all the Nordic countries in those proposals, because we need to take the entire Europe into account. So I think a Nordic ESPANET will provide opportunity to focus more exclusively perhaps on the Nordic countries and the Nordicness of these countries. And also to provide a platform for developing new research projects together, and perhaps also in dialogue and collaboration with countries outside of Europe, for instance, Asian countries or the US and Canada. It makes sense to compare perhaps with the Nordic countries as a cluster than just to focus on one single Nordic country.
Yeah, to add, I mean, I was a part of Reassess, and we were cooperating a lot with Nordwell, and I really miss that dialogue. And obviously, since there are so many participants, I'm not the only one. So there's a different dialogue if it's only us, the Nordic countries. It's somehow, we have a common platform, and we can go directly to the subject. We don't need to present everything before we start discussing things. And even though we have a lot of Nordic cooperation and other conferences, I think we have this need for social policy conferences, and I really hope that we get this going.
Jan, would you like to add something?
I just wanted to add that I think that a lot of us have had our career started in places like this. So my own career started in Helsinki many years ago, maybe 28 years ago or something. And we had met in Sweden to a social policy conference there, and then the Finns said, why don't we meet up in Finland and start a Nordic project? And we all said, yes, why not? And then we were joking to each other and saying, when are we going to the sauna? And the Finns said, we're going to do that after the meeting. And that was sort of the standing joke the whole day. And in the evening, we were walking towards a restaurant, we thought, and said, but what about the sauna? We're going to miss that. No, that'll be where we're going to eat. And actually, the Finns took us to a sauna. And that was a delegation led by Hannu Uusitalo and Mikko Kauto. I don't know if he's here still, was there, and Björn Minden was there. So a lot of people who became friends also, were sort of laying the basis of this research network. I don't think we should start in the sauna anymore, but I think that having places where we can meet and talk to each other are really essential for improving the quality and for launching new projects. So I think that's a very good idea.
Good. So we think it's good for the younger researchers or younger scholars, good for high quality research, good place to meet your colleagues and get new ideas. We have a talk that we will organize a PhD course or workshop next year, and then there will be a conference like this in 2021. Keep posted. We will be sending you emails through the European Social Policy Analysis mailing list. So. And of course, well, at this point, let's give thanks to the panelists. Thank you. We hope to see you in there 2 weeks, 2 years. The discussion on the Nordic welfare states will continue, and next we will hear about one possibility that allows a platform for further discussion. Please welcome editor Mikko Poutanen from the Politiikka journal.
Well, actually, I'll be talking about Politiikka stuff,
Okay, so it's not this one?
No. So that's just giving Politiikka stuff. So, thank you everyone. It's been a pleasure to be a part of this and listen to all the presentations, the plenaries, and the panel. Politiikasta is a Finnish web journal that focuses on popularizing research in social sciences and political science and so on and so forth. And we would like to invite you, all of you who have presented papers here today, to consider submitting a paper. We do publish in Finnish and Swedish and also in English, but usually the terms are that you would have to be a researcher who is located in Finland doing your research. So unfortunately we do not take in submissions from all across the board from all international parties, but if you are doing research in Finland, in Swedish, or in English, you're very welcome to submit your manuscripts to us. As this is a popularized web journal, this means that they're much shorter, about 10,000 characters, but we can then also have a discussion that maybe if you need more space, that is possible, and I will give you one brief example here. Just, I typoed it, but let's hope, no, okay. You've got technology, such a pleasure always. Okay, this isn't, it helps if you turn it in Finnish. Oh, here you go. So this was one of the more recent articles that we published. The title in Finnish is The Nordic Welfare State, the Friend or Foe of a Career Woman. So this is, we're publishing text like this. This takes about 5 minutes to read, and it's not very long, but it's always by researchers, not only for other researchers, but also for the population at large, for larger audiences, to share your research that's relevant. It doesn't have to be immediately relevant to that very week, day, or month, but it can also be of a more broader issues that you want to discuss. So again, please consider us as a venue of publication, especially if you have shorter papers to discuss, and thank you very much.
Okay, it has come time to close up the conference. I hope you all have plenty to take with you back home. I certainly have. I have really enjoyed the plenary sessions and the panel sessions that I have attended, and I'm more convinced that we have the Nordic model. It is changing. It's different what it used to be back in the 1980s or 1990s. I got really great ideas from Björn's and Pauli's presentations yesterday about the future of the Nordic welfare research, what we should do and how we should do it. The talk by Marta Soler-Gallers was really, really inspiring. I hope you all enjoy it. I'm really looking forward to the work and actions of this new network, and hopefully we see you in two years. This kind of conferences don't come true without those who are willing to put their hearts and hours into that. I want to thank the local organizing committee and the scientific advisory board who have been actively taking part in planning this conference. I especially want to thank the students from Tampere University, University of Tampere, who have been here for 2 days and helping you with all kinds of practical things. And I was so pleased to hear that you yourself voluntarily offered to help here. So I think our future is bright because we have so bright young students who are studying social policy. Of course, I would like to thank the collaborating partners, the National Institute for Health and Welfare and the Finnish Center for Pensions. But last but not least, there's one particular person who has done enormous amount of work for this conference, and that is Paula Saikkonen. Let's give her a big And of course, for our panelists, we have something special for you. Yes. X. So thank you, everybody. Have a safe trip back home. See you.